Hello, everyone. Over the next 4 weeks, we will be dropping a special episode of the Job Hunting Podcast from our 2022 collection into your feed. We're doing this because we believe these episodes are great for this time of the year. Sometimes, even as we are recording and editing them, we earmark them for the festive season. Secondly, we believe in repetition. I have often listened to podcast episodes 2 or 3 times to let the message sink in. If you have already listened to these episodes before, my advice is to listen again, and you will uncover a few more gems and great advice from them. And finally, we do this because we as a team need to take a break, but we don't want to leave you hanging. You see, festive seasons can be triggering to job hunters. It can make you feel more stressed and lonely in your job search. I remember this very well because I've been there and I don't want you to feel like I did. So for me, keeping the podcast and my newsletter going out weekly is incredibly important and is part of the support system that I provide for you. Many people ask me, should I keep looking for work during the holidays? Or should I just give up and start again, let's say at the end of January? My answer is always, it depends. If you are looking for work now, my message to you is keep looking. There will be less competition, even though fewer roles are usually advertised around this time. I do think it's still a good thing to keep looking and keep the momentum going and build yourself a job hunting discipline, even if you're doing just one small task per day. To learn how to best organize your schedule to fit job hunting in your daily and weekly routine, you can download my free resource. It's called the Optimized Job Search. You can find it on my website, renatabernardi.com. That's RENATABERNARDE.com. There's also a link to it in this episode's show notes. Remember, I am with you. You should carry on, and the newsletters and podcasts are here to provide you with accountability, knowledge, and support. Now, let's listen to this episode. Hi, I'm Renata Bernardi, and this is the Job Hunting Podcast, where I interview experts and professionals and discuss issues that are important for job hunters and those who are working to advance their careers. So make sure that you subscribe and follow, and let's dive right in. My friend Gary Ryan wrote a book about leadership in times of disruption. To write his book, Gary interviewed several Australian leaders and observed as they led and tried their best to manage large organizations and small during lockdowns and several disruptions that have happened in the past couple of years. I interviewed Gary today to get his insight on what great leadership looks like in this new normal that we're living in 2022, and how job seekers and career enthusiasts, professionals, senior executives can get ready for their job search and finding the great place that they want to work. I interviewed Gary for this episode to understand from him what great leadership looks like. So when you are looking for a job, you know how to identify the best organizations to fit you, the ones with better leadership, better culture, the ones that are looking forward, that are preparing themselves for the future. Gary is an expert in leadership. He's a consultant, he's an author, and a great person all around. I hope you enjoy this chat where we start discussing his careers and his strengths and how he changed careers over time until he found his niche. We also discuss how to answer that terrible question that we all get in job interviews: what is your leadership style? And then we discuss issues as how to identify the best organization for you as you progress in your career and try to find the best fit for your skills and experience. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I sure did. It just flows when I'm talking to Gary every time. We have such great connection, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Hi, Gary.
Welcome, Renata. How are you?
Welcome. I say welcome. Welcome you, Gary.
Looking forward to speaking with you today.
Oh, great. So, first of all, I like all my guests to tell us a little bit about their careers before we begin, because it's always great to hear a good career story. And I know that yours is pretty good. So, tell us about your career so far, Gary. What took you from wherever you started to what you're doing now?
Well, I thought I was going to be a secondary physical education teacher. So that was my first degree. I was involved in a head-on car accident when I was 19, which was pretty serious. And my girlfriend at the time actually suffered a brain injury. So that was a huge shake-up event for life. But she ended up okay. If you ever met her today, Renata, you wouldn't know that she'd been through what she went through. That delayed me completing that course. And in the end, I had the record for my cohort of taking 7.5 years to complete the 4-year undergraduate degree. But it meant that when I graduated, there were no jobs for phys ed teachers. You literally could not get one. So I went into the fitness industry, which happened to be related to the tertiary sector. And my first full-time job was actually commercialising a fitness centre for Monash University at its Caulfield campus, and then contributed to the Peninsula campus. Was involved with university sport as a result of that for a period of time. Recognised a bit of a glass ceiling with sport, though. Australia's population isn't that as much as we've got professional sports here. There really weren't that many great paying jobs. So I decided I needed to go back to university, and along that way started exploring getting out of sport and into more of the commercial side of the operations. That led me into a senior role in an organisation that was partly owned by the university and the student unions, which involved retail, hospitality, sports. So we did everything from looking after the sports fields to running pubs, but it also included the career service and student development programs. And eventually evolved into some organisations such as the National Australia Bank, the Commonwealth Car Service, which is the service that drives around the Prime Minister and all the ministers and special guests to Australia, all the VIPs, etc. So it's a national agency. And they came and tapped us on the shoulder and asked us if we could help them with their culture, because we'd been working on a servant leadership and values-based culture. And so I got tapped on the shoulder to be the one to become the head consultant, which is when I started to learn consulting skills. And as a result of all of that story, in 2007, I decided to start Organisations That Matter, which is my company, and that I wanted to work with organisations that recognise they had human beings in them and human beings matter. So I have been working ever since then for 15 years. We just turned 15 back in February, and I've been working with organisations that in some cases, Renata, recognise that they're not that good at treating people like human beings, but they want to. In other cases, and probably most of the cases, they're actually quite good at it, but they want to be great. And there's a gap that they've got, and there's an exponential difference between good and great. It's not a straight line. And that's fundamentally the gap that I tend to work in with the organisations that I serve. There's my story.
That's great, Gary. Before we go on and talk about leaders and the organizations that you've been working with, I want to ask you 2 questions about your career trajectory. First of all, a lot of Generation Zs, the people that are graduating just before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now when things are going back to this new normal, they're finding it hard to get jobs too. What was it during the time you graduated after 7.5 years of undergrad degree that made it hard for you to find a job as a school teacher?
There just weren't. The government had changed some rules. They were actually importing PE teachers when I started my degree. But when I finished, because of Jeff Kennett, it's well known, and some changes that had happened here in the state of Victoria, there were no teaching jobs. There literally were none. Now, I knew that about a year out from graduating eventually. So I looked around, and I suppose this is one of, you've got to face your reality. And my reality was this degree I'd been doing, which, to be brutally honest, Renata, I actually worked out I didn't really want to be a teacher with people who didn't want to learn. I realised I actually have teaching skills, but I wanted to, and the seeds for my consulting work were actually planted way back then. I wanted to work with people who wanted to learn, right? So I actually discovered that finishing that degree, but I knew normal trajectory wasn't available. So I looked around, and at the time I was working as a casual gym instructor, which is where I met my wife, in fact, who was also a casual gym instructor. So I love Monash for that. We have 5 beautiful children for Michelle and my children. them. But working there, I could see that Monash had only taken over the Caulfield and Peninsula campuses 4 years earlier, and the quality and the difference between the facilities at the Clayton campus and the Caulfield and other campuses was a massive gap. So I guessed something had to happen.
I see.
Yeah, and so
So you were looking at alternatives. You saw it coming. You were looking at alternatives. And I think I want to focus on this point for a little bit, because even though my clientele is not that young, I know that there are young people in the audience for the Job Hunting podcast. And I know that they are exiting the workforce more than others during the pandemic. And even now they are, confused about what their careers will look like post-pandemic. And I think that learning from somebody like you who also had issues when they graduated is a good thing.
Well, look, the similar thing actually happened when I formed my business. Some things had happened with the university, and there was a change in senior leadership in the university, and they decided to restructure. And despite the positive performance of the organisation, they made 460 of our staff redundant. I didn't receive a forced redundancy, but there was a voluntary one available to me. And I knew that as well a year out. So in both instances, so I was obviously a lot older for the second time when that came around. That was 15 years later. Both instances, it's all about keeping your head up. And I know you use that language, keep your head up, look at what's going on. You've spoken recently about the sunk costs fallacy. I didn't know that language. I didn't know that theory then, but I guess deep down I understood it. And so in the first instance, keeping my head up and looking around, I could see something had to happen. And I was going to position myself that if it happened, the concept is I got a PE degree, right? So I'll use a sporting one. The easiest place in most sports to score a goal is from right in front of the goals. Is it guaranteed the ball will come to you? Is it guaranteed that if it does, you will still kick a goal? But hey, it's the best place to be, right?
Yeah.
So I actually approached my manager at the time at the gym and said, could I create a course that doesn't exist for members, that they would actually have to pay for to have access to, but I won't charge you anything to run this course? Now, maybe that was not so smart, but I was doing this about my future and getting experience and runs on the board. That was going to be my payment. And I wanted to make it as easy as possible for my boss to say yes. There was no cost to the boss, right? And they said yes. I ended up running 3 cycles of this course over that 12-month period, leading into when that job actually became available. And I've had it confirmed that was the thing that got me across the line to the job compared to the other person who was shortlisted.
That's great. I'm glad you mentioned the sunk cost fallacy, because one thing that you mentioned before about doing the degree in education and realizing that you weren't really keen to teach any student, there was a specific student. Now, you could have used the sunk cost fallacy to drop out and do something else, but I'm glad that you finished your degree. And and sometimes people get confused about the sunk cost decision making. Yeah. If you've invested a lot of time into something, you can always recycle that. Right? I don't want people to regret spending time or investing money in projects that don't go ahead exactly as they planned, because I do believe in the power of recycling everything in your life and making every opportunity a project, an experience that you wear as a badge of honor, and it moves you forward. So never regret things from your past, but make decisions that are good for your future.
Yes, look, I'll be dead straight. 5.5 years into that degree, I was at the point of, do I quit? Is this a sunk cost for me? Again, it wasn't the language I was using, but that's really what I was asking. And my now wife, then my partner at the time, Michelle, we discussed it together, and she said, look, no, it's like a bus ticket. And it really was. That undergraduate degree was like a bus ticket, that it really didn't matter if I didn't end up being a teacher, but that ticket got me onto a bus that you couldn't get on without that ticket, without a degree.
Yes.
And that bus could take you to all sorts of places, which absolutely in my story is true. I do not regret one iota pushing through in that case, even though I knew I wasn't most likely going to be a teacher. The system helped me by making it an impossibility in the short term, which I'm grateful for.
And Gary, one more question about your career story that caught my attention. It was that you decided that you wanted to do something commercial. What triggered you to think, no, I think that I have a strength here, that I'm good at this and I want to get better at it? What made you identify that as a strength?
Well, I understood service excellence really deeply, and that's applicable in any field. Now, clearly the commercial space is where there's more money and quite frankly, it was just going to be more opportunity to be able to earn a higher salary, still doing what I love doing and using a talent and strength that I've got. So it made sense to me to broaden my experience. And I never have ever left behind the not-for-profit side of things either. So universities and student development, I still choose to spend about 20% of my time deliberately in that space, even though the returns aren't the same as in the commercial world that I work. But I just love working with students. I just love the energy, both undergrad and graduate students. And when people, bag Gen Zs and millennials, I mean, I've got a couple of children that are exactly them myself, but I don't understand why they bag them. It makes no sense to me. To me, the fundamental difference is they don't tolerate things that maybe my generation tolerated that aren't so good in a culture. And when an organisation promises something and then doesn't deliver it, we would probably wear it on the chin and say we have to cop that. Whereas they go, and hold on, you promised this and you haven't delivered. I'm not hanging around for that. I applaud that.
No, that's great. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's because we have kids that age. It makes us really soft with them, but I love them. And so in terms of the strengths that you bring to the work that you do, my coaching is all about strengths. We work on elevating the strengths in the same way that you said some of your client organizations are good already. They just want to be great. What was the strength that was built inside you as a DNA that has helped your career, Gary?
Well, this is where I have to thank my family, and I have to thank the fact that I'm number 9 with a twin, so we're 9 and 10, and a blue-collar family. I have 4 first cousins, and for males to go to university just isn't what happened in my broader family on both my mother and father's side of the families. As a result of going down a different path, I can tell you the story if you like about how this came about, but
I'd love it. Go ahead. Tell the story.
well, when my twin brother and I were 10, our parents sat us both down, as they had done with our siblings, and asked us where we wanted to go to secondary school. Okay, they're blue-collar family, but both my parents, my mother got taken out of school at age 14, my father at age 15. They both actually liked school, so they highly valued education because it was taken away from them due to economic reasons, etc., and their stories. And they sat us down, they said, where do you want to go to secondary school? And I said, I want to go to university. And Dad said, well, I'm talking about secondary school, son, and you're talking about university, and what are you going to do at university anyway? I said, I don't know. And he said, well, why do you want to go to university? And I said, I just know I've got 10 thumbs. I don't really like swinging the hammer in the garage with you and my brothers. I'm pretty good at school. I'm pretty smart at school. I think I should go to university. But to get there, I think I should go to the boys' secondary school, the local boys' secondary. And so Dad goes, oh, okay. And he turns to my twin brother and he says, where do you want to go to school? And he goes, oh, I've heard they do too much homework at those boys' schools. So I want to go to secondary school with where my brothers go, and I want to be a tradesman like you. So Dad said, okay, he points at me and says, all right, you can go to the local boys' secondary school and you can do that homework. He points at my twin brother and says, you can go to the local technical school with your brothers. And then he pointed at himself and said, I'll go and get myself a second part-time job. So he had a full-time job, one part-time job. Now he was saying, I'll go get a second part-time job so I can pay for you to go to that local boys' school.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. And I knew that. And so as a result of that, there was no way I was going to have poor grades.
Yes. Oh, you have to live up to those expectations and that hard work. I wanted you to tell us the story, Gary, because I do have clients that come from blue collar families, and they are now executives, senior executives, and there is something that they carry with them that is a lot of pride, but also their sense of place in that executive presence that they haven't really received from growing up in a blue collar family. And I'll tell you, my background is very different from yours. I'm third generation expat. So my grandfather worked in Washington, D.C. My dad worked in the Silicon Valley. Here I am in Australia. So the amount of knowledge and vicarious learning that I got from observing them, even though my mom didn't go to uni, she was also quite an intellectual. So it makes a huge difference in building up your executive presence and your ability to liaise at that senior exec levels, which you had to learn in a different way. And I had to develop for organizations that I worked for. As you know, I worked for Monash,
Mm.
developing the master's students career readiness program, and then at the Institute of Chartered Accountants, bringing a more diversity to the accounting profession here in Australia. And it's very different, isn't it? Did you feel that as you were entering the corporate sector?
Well, and yes, and this is where I guess my strength, this is the relationship back to my strength. Okay. So as a result of that journey, when I finally finished that degree, I swore I'm never going back to university. I'm so glad to be out of there, right? And my grades weren't particularly great. But as a result of that car accident that had happened along the way, I actually realized I needed to do some work on me, and I started to read, and I was not a great reader. And I'm such an advocate for reading now, and for, since 1988, I started reading again. And I haven't stopped. And I chose to be a student of leadership, whether I was studying it or not. So even though I thought I'm going to finish, one of the things that started to emerge from me was that I actually quite like, as a result of my reading, and I actually quite like the idea of trying to put it into practice, which is what I was doing in my early career once I got those jobs that I mentioned at the start, right? And then that led to going back to university in 1999 to do my first graduate degree. And I loved it. I loved what I was studying. And then when I got to do my master's degree, I loved it even more because we actually had 30 people in the organisation. You might recall the master's program that some of us were doing at the time at Monash. And we were able to negotiate with Monash University that the content and all the assignments would be on the organisation, because the intent was we wanted to get theory and practice and put it together. So this comes to my strength. With having 10 siblings who are strongly blue collar, I do have a sister that's a teacher qualified as well. So fundamentally 9, 2 of us more white collar, and the rest, I guess, were more blue collar. To explain to them what I do along the journey, I've had to be able to find the way to find the communication skills and the language so they could actually understand what I do. And over time, I guess that blue collar background and my studies has led to what I believe is my gift, is that I can speak with anybody. I can talk to C-suite people at the language they need to hear and understand. And I've literally been in minefields and outback Australia. I've been in train yards here in Melbourne, Victoria, and everything in between. And I seem to be able to find a way to communicate big concepts with people in a way that they can understand. That's my gift. That's my talent.
It's such a gift. I had the word gift in my mind as you were saying. It's such an important thing. And even though it may not be a strength to other people, it might be something that you need to work on regardless of what your strengths and DNA is, because communicating at all levels is essential for career advancement, career progression, or career sustainability. And that also means communicating with a younger audience as you get older, and all of a sudden you see all of these youngsters coming in. I know my dad struggled with that. If you're listening, Dad, you may remember. But it's really important to have that. So well done. Now, you mentioned being a student of leadership. Now you are a consultant and a teacher. You have, if people are watching this episode on YouTube behind you, you have your brand new book on banners, Disruption Leadership Matters. A lot of people going through recruitment and selection process, Gary, they are asked a very simple question halfway through their interviews, which is, tell me about your leadership style.
Yeah.
And they struggle to answer it, even if they have been leading for a decade, even if they have large teams. So why is it that people struggle to answer that question?
Because if you just Googled the word leadership, you will have over 1 billion hits on that one word. There are so many answers. And I think because there are so many answers, without doing some smart, hard work that I'm going to advocate for in a moment, it's confusing. Well, what's the answer? What's the right answer? Now, the fact is, with 1 billion responses, there's no one right answer. The most important answer, and this is where the smart, hard work kicks in, Renata, is for people to actually work out, and I get people to do this all the time, what's the 7 to 10 behaviors of what you think an effective leader is? Just write them down from your life's experience, whether they're the opposite of what you experienced because you had poor leadership, or whether you actually got to experience the great leadership. What are the 7 to 10 things? Now, once you do that, sometimes then when you do your reading, and it might be 10 minutes per day, five times a week, 50 minutes a week of reading, watching YouTube videos, listening to audio books, podcasts, whatever it might be that comes into your 10 minutes of being a student of leadership. And think about that for a moment. Doesn't sound like much. How much would have you had the opportunity to be exposed to over 12 months,
Yes.
over 24 months, over 10 years? Like, it's enormous how much you can be. And what happens is you can find, eventually what will happen is a style of leadership you might come across, you go, gosh, that matches what I believe. So now I have a label that I can use. So for me, it's servant leadership. It matches what I believe. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is also effectively authentic leadership, inclusive leadership. They're all very similar labels about the same principles that I tend to believe in about what makes an effective leader. So if you do that little bit of work, it actually makes that question a lot easier to answer.
Yes. I think it's important when you identify a trending label like servant leadership, which has been trending for a while, by the way, that you are able to not only identify yourself, if you're listening, I'm talking to you, that you're not only able to identify yourself as being a servant leader, but then argue it. Right? You
Yes.
can't just say it. Now, it really demonstrate how and give examples in your answer for that. It's very important job interview question. So there lies the need to do the research. And there are two things that I find happen, Gary, when I'm talking to clients is when they are avid readers like you and I, but they do not make the connection and blend what they're reading with their career and themselves, so they're detached from the theory. Ideally, what I like to ask my clients to do as part of their homework is to bring that together, and I have things that sit behind my coaching to help them do that. But the other thing is that they don't really explain and give a good example of their leadership in action.
Yes, yeah, and that's key. You see, if you, in my, I guess from my perspective, Renato, I think we're on the same page here. Is that if you haven't developed that level of clarity, it's really hard to give an example. It's really hard to actually put it into practice. Now, you absolutely can reflect back on previous examples and go, I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. And now I understand it. Now I can tell the story. As an example, when I got that first job commercializing that fitness center for Monash University, I had already become a senior coach at the age of 27 of a suburban men's football team. So I was coaching men, many of whom were much older than me. Again, because of my family situation, working with people older really wasn't that big a deal to me. But I was actually I was doing servant leadership then, even though I never knew what it was. I didn't understand what it was. We were focused on vision and values. And as I was reading, I actually realized what I was doing as a football coach, I wasn't doing in my job. I wasn't leading like that in my job. I was still command and control. I'm the know-it-all leader. And I had this epiphany where I went, why aren't I doing this at work? So the skills I developed and were practicing and putting into practice in a sporting context were 100% transferable into my career. And the moment I made that connection, my career just went like this. And it's never really stopped.
Gary, we learn so much from sports, and I often use sports analogies as well to explain things as you do, because it's everywhere. And it's so easy to understand. I could use analogies from, let's say, a Shakespearean play, but I'm not sure if many people would get it. But with sports, like it or not, it's easy. And where you can also get so much knowledge of how to operate successfully in the world? Nature. There's so much we can learn from nature. Right? I don't know if you got my newsletter yesterday, and I will put a link in the show notes below for those who are not yet subscribed. If you're not, you should. And the article was about magpies and how they working together as a group were removing the tags that scientists had put on them. And they worked out a way to help each other remove those tags, the magpies. And I was like, this is amazing. It shows that we are all animals, and working as a group, as a team, we can collaborate and succeed in tasks much better. If in their case, they thought maybe that's an alien thing, that's, a parasite or something. They didn't know it was a scientific experiment. But I thought There's so much that we can learn. And for me, the analogy that I was trying to make is group coaching. Like it's fantastic. People sometimes look down on it. And I'm like, no, it's actually very good. You can
100%.
learn not only from me, but you can learn from each other. So, yeah, nature and sports, everyone. I often like to recommend people watch documentaries about sports and nature. There's so many great sports documentary there, especially for job seekers that are going through recruitment and selection process over and over again and falling short. Just watch the Netflix series about Formula One, and you will
Mm.
see a whole bunch of really, really great guys all trying to get to the finish line and how hard it is.
Oh yes, and it's fascinating that life has gifted me our middle child, who's 17 in year 12 now, as a performing artist, and his name's Callum, and to see what Callum does, and to see through, I guess I grew up with a sporting lens, but what he's doing as a performing artist with the shows that they put on and the way that they have to live on stage when something goes wrong, just like those magpies, find a way to fix it with
Improvise.
no one noticing, is just amazing. And it's been beautiful for me to become closer to seeing that world through that lens, I guess, now, and seeing the beauty of the skills equally valid in that space as well. And so whether people like that might be in your audience, they might be involved with a church choir of whatever religious space, or they might be involved in a club it's a club to do with Lego, and they're on the committee.
Yeah.
Absolutely 100% transferable experiences and skills. And so when they share those sorts of stories, and I'm not sure if you've touched on this, but a lot of folk I find think that those stories are irrelevant for a job interview. My view is, if you haven't got a better one and that's what you've got, then use it. Just at the end, explain how you would transfer that experience across into a workplace environment. Well, in other words, what's the core lesson and how would you transfer that across if you got this job? So if you hired me, from what I just told you about that Lego committee story, this is how this might look.
That's great. I love that. I love that example. Thank you, Gary. That's a great tip. I wanted to shift gears now to talk about leadership under turbulence, under disruption. You mentioned disruption. Throughout the COVID years, I have been talking a lot about VUCA. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and how important it is for every professional, not just the senior execs, to be familiar with that term and operating in that term, creating strategies, and the importance of foresight, looking forward instead of looking backwards with forecasting, which we do quite well. But I am so keen to know from you, because you've written a book. You're one of those amazing people that use the pandemic in a very productive way and wrote not only any book, but a book that has been so well received. What have you learned about being a leader during disruption?
I think it's summarized in a single word, and that's called care. I think what leaders have recognized, and some of them are in the book that weren't as familiar with how important it was as it quickly became for them, that they need to genuinely care. They need to genuinely care about whatever the organisation's trying to achieve. So Raymond O'Flaherty, the CEO of the Metro Trains Melbourne, Metro Trains were smashed by the pandemic because people stopped using public transport, and it's still a concern for a lot of people. And yet he had a workforce of 6,500 people that he serves that were required to still go to work, because we still have our health workers, we still had our police force, our ambulance folk, etc., the hospital workers who needed to be able to get to and from work. But he had a workforce that needed to feel safe as possible in a risky job now, because at that time, especially at the start of 2020, they didn't know what this virus really was. And so as much as Raymond was allowed to, according to the rules, he physically put himself out there to be with the staff where they were working, at the very minimum saying, thank you for showing up. He cared enough to know that was so important. I just need to thank you for showing up. And the recognition that so many leaders had with the pivot that people did. And I know it feels like such a long time ago now, that week or 2 weeks when we all went from this world of going to work in a physical environment to we're working from home, and millions of people use their own resources to enable often in days or at most a week, maybe 2 weeks, to keep the work happening. Remember that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so a lot of the leaders I found in my book, Christina Hermanson from FMC Australia, New Zealand, which is a chemical company that works with insecticides and that serves the agricultural industry, which was really important for keeping the food production going, etc. And she recognised the importance work of the pivot that the team that she led had done, and on one level recognised, can I ever really repay that? You know, can I ever really repay that pivot that people did? And I've got to continue to care with show care. So when in their instance they were based in Sydney for their Australian head office, so they didn't quite go through what we did here in Melbourne in late 2020, they were able to start to experiment, and this was a deliberate choice of words, experiment how we go back to the office. So they've actually been doing it for about a bit more than a year and a half of in and out of this experiment about what's going to work. And they agreed, well, okay, we'll have a Tuesday and a Wednesday when everyone will be in the office. And then there's one day a week extra where the teams need to be in the office and they can decide which day of the week that is. And let's experiment and see how that goes. My understanding is they've not found a better way. And to still be open to the possibility of change as we're now in this hybrid world. And you mentioned foresight, Renata. It's hard to imagine we're not in hybrid forever.
Yes, yes. I was going to ask you that now. From what you've observed, talking to so many great leaders, how do you think people that are trying to change jobs and find the best organizations to work for? Because there are lots of people that have decided that 2022 is the year that they will change jobs, either because they spent 2 years thinking about it but didn't change, because people don't usually change when there's too much uncertainty, and that's normal. So there's a backlog of resignations that didn't happen for 2 years that are probably happening now, but also disappointment with organizations that did not fare well with the disruption, right? So there's those two things combined across the world. We're seeing the great resignation happening and reverberations of that happening in Australia as well. What do you think the listeners who are looking for a job should be looking for when they are applying for? What are the signals of great leadership within an organization?
Well, this is controversial, what I'm about to say.
Oh, we love controversy here, Gary.
Well, I think the thing that the pandemic has really brought to the surface is this term human resources, human capital, human assets. Okay. Now, I would argue strongly that the organisations that really haven't behaved particularly well from a leadership and culture perspective over the past 2 years, which is why people are choosing to leave in many instances. So they're leaving a boss, they're leaving a culture, they're leaving a manager, they're leaving a culture, is because they've been treated as a resource. And that was actually what catalysed my book. There was a couple of examples fairly close to home where it was very clear, despite all the nice superlatives and all the nice talk about how important they are, and that classic, people are our greatest asset. This is an asset or a resource. A computer's an asset. A house is an asset potentially. Like, that's not what a human being is. Like, we've used this language. People don't realise these concepts come from Taylorism, Frederick Winslow Taylor, and the production line of Henry Ford over 110 years ago. And yes, there's a lot to be said for the 20th century and the growth that was created from the Industrial Revolution that really exploded in the 20th century. But there's a lot to be said that's not great from the 20th century that we now realise the way we've treated our planet and our resources maybe isn't so good. And I would argue treating human beings as a 20th century concept in the 21st century has been proven over the past 2 years not to be any good. So here's where it's controversial, Renata. If you're going for a job and the person that's going to interview you or recruit you has human resources in their title, what's that telling you? What's that telling you? They still haven't changed. They think you're a resource. Why would you do that to yourself? And until there is no one to recruit because people aren't going to those companies, or these leaders have no one to lead, I'm afraid many of them aren't going to change. They're going to keep working on this old industrial revolution, industrial age thinking that you're a resource. And ultimately, that means you're a number. And I would suspect many folk, if they're experienced on this call, will have experienced what it feels like to be treated like a number by your organisation.
Yeah,
right?
that's
It's not
so
great,
true.
right? It's not great. And so that's the first point is Ask the question, if they're still recalling people with human resources, is that where I want to go? And then secondly, do your homework. Use tools like LinkedIn to reach out to people that are already working in these organizations and ask the question, what's it really like to work there on a day-to-day basis? Do you have the autonomy you would expect to have in the role that you've got with your experience? Can you tell me about that? Are you getting to continue to learn and develop skills that are useful for you and your future? And do you feel that the work you're doing is contributing to a greater good of some degree? Like there, Daniel Pink's Venn diagram of purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And we know that folk that are working in the intersection of that Venn diagram are highly engaged people who are going home quite happy. So they're terrific questions for people to be asking as part of their research, Renata.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Gary. That leads me to maybe sort of the tail end of our conversation. I'd like you to tell me, by researching so many leaders for the past couple of years, what will organizations of the future look like? I mean, you work with organizations, you're seeing them develop over the course of your career. So this is not just about the pandemic, right? It's about you seeing the progress and you seeing how organizations evolve. Now we've had this massive disruption. We probably should learn how to live with further disruption, because this is not the last one that we will see, maybe even in this decade. So what would a great organization of the future look like for my listeners?
Well, I think, and this probably isn't going to be a surprise to most folk, but the diversity and inclusion aspect is that organizations have come to realize, or that the good or the ones moving towards great have recognized that we need to look more like the people that we're ultimately serving. So if we've got an executive team that looks a particular way and it's very similar, probably isn't matching the people that we're serving ultimately. Now, whether that means we need people from different cultural backgrounds, or whether we need that people from different genders or people from non-specific genders, whatever it might be, I think that's been the step change. So for me, disruption means we've moved from organic change or incremental change to actually step change. So diversity and inclusion has been around for a long time, but I think the past 2 years have really awakened many leaders, even the great ones, to recognizing we need to get busy on this work. Now, that's going to create a lot of opportunities for a lot of folk on the call and potentially frighten some others. Folks that look like me potentially. But equally, people like me are still part of diversity and inclusion. So just yesterday, I was speaking with a group of consultants that are looking at having me potentially join them as an executive partner. And, what they said to me was, we actually don't have any males your age or your experience in our organization. We're predominantly female. We've got a lot of diversity there, but we actually need some diversity. So, that was, I guess, it was refreshing, but I just want to help people that look maybe like me not to be fearful and get too focused on, okay, no one wants me. I don't believe that's true. Okay.
That's diversity coming full circle, isn't it, Gary?
Well, it does, and it needs to. Absolutely, it is, isn't it? And look, I have been privileged enough through my career that I would have never really thought too much about it. My wife Michelle is of Sri Lankan background. We don't think it's really impacted her background in any negative way here in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne. We're such a multicultural city, but maybe it has, that we're not quite as fully aware. But I think that's the key going forward, is that importance of diversity, because we know through research, right, that it brings the diversity of thinking and it brings questions that we otherwise wouldn't ask. And if we're going to continue to learn our way forward, so that's a phrase I believe the organisations have now clearer than ever about, Renata, is that they've got to learn their way forward. Innovation's a big part of that. So they've got to innovate with their products, their services, their processes. And right now we're in this massive innovation period of how we get to work in this hybrid environment.
Gary, are there any issues or topics or ideas that you really wanted to share with the listeners today and we didn't have a chance to talk about? This is your time to come up with ideas if you want to, or just let us know how people can connect with you as well. That's also important.
Sure. So there's a couple of things there. I want to be really clear that, and I cover this in my book in a small section, that while we've got the great resignation happening, which one of my heroes, Michelle Hunt, calls the great soul searching, and another hero, Gary Ridge, calls the great escape, there's those three terms being used. And it can feel like it's all a one-way street about engagement, that it's all the organization's responsibility. I believe there is a responsibility, and yes, the leadership and yes, the culture has a massive impact, but we equally have a responsibility for being engaged in the work that we do. To help us be engaged, what I have seen through my career and my work, Renata, is the happiest people are the ones working at the intersection of their talents and their passion. Now, once you know what those two things are, I believe that intersection is actually quite large. And once you've got that clarity, so for some of your listeners, maybe they need to do some work to help work out, well, what are my talents? What are my passions? Because it can be plural. And then that can help shape where we are. Now, sometimes the talent might be something like people say to you, you're so funny. And 20 people say that to you, that you're funny. Maybe you've got a talent for that. Yes. Maybe working on breakfast radio is a possibility. That you never thought of breakfast radio. Generally speaking, people on breakfast radio are either super serious because of the channel they're on, or they're trying to be funny. Right. And you don't have to be a comedian, though, but you might have a talent for it. This makes sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, once you become aware of your passions, that can then help you look for the organizations that have roles that fit at that intersection. So I guess that's a key message that I'd love to share.
Oh, thanks, Gary. And you know, that's part of what we talk about all the time here on this podcast. So the listeners that have been following us will know that we're banging on a note that we really like to bang on. But how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way? If they want to buy your book, we will have a link in the show notes for sure. But if they want to work with you, how can they reach you?
So for the book, it's disruptionleadershipmatters.com, or through any good online bookstore. It was Amazon Kindle, where we went to #1 in a couple of categories in January. orgsthatmatter.com. So my company, they can see the name, Organisations That Matter, but it's a bit shorter for the web address. It's orgsthatmatter.com. They're the easiest ways to get in contact me, or in fact through LinkedIn. Gary Ryan 1 is my tag at the end of the LinkedIn little URL at the start. So Gary Ryan 1 for LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to connect with people. I'm not sure why LinkedIn shifted things to sort of pushing people to follow. I'm happy to connect with people.
Okay. Now, we will have all the links below in the episode show notes, everyone. So if you're interested to know more about Gary and his book, don't forget to check the links. Gary, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic seeing you again, and we should catch up for a coffee soon.
It sounds like we're going to do that 100% for sure, Renata, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you.
We have loved making this episode for you, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you for your support this year, especially if you are a newsletter subscriber and a regular listener to this podcast. If you have not yet subscribed to my newsletter for the job hunters and career enthusiasts, please go to my website, renatabernardi.com, or follow the link available in the episode show notes. And if you need extra support during the festive season, you can find on my website an online course called Reset Your Career, and also a talent assessment called Find My Talents. They are always available and ready for you when you're ready for them. Ciao for now, and I'll see you next time.